Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation for the Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment, or SEAH study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 15th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the first in a series of regional consultations and discussions on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, which I will simply refer to as SEAH from here forth. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, and also by Samantha Hung, Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the ADB. We're also joined by Malika Shagazatova, a Social Development Specialist on Gender and Development, again with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, and Dr. Zainab El-Bakri, a Senior Consultant on Gender and Safeguards for the ADB. All four of the individuals and many others, including Madhu Gupta and Oliver Chapman and the rest of the gender team, have played various roles in the authorship and preparation of the study as they pertain to the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statements. Other experts will be on hand for the Q&A session, including Zonabel Woods, Oliver Chapman, and Madhu Gupta, who are also with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. And I know they all look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. This is our first interactive consultation on the issue of SEAH, and it builds on the previous sessions on gender that we had. Today, we have about 85 pre-registered participants from a number of countries throughout Central, South, and West Asia, as well as the Caucasus, as well as some from Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Most of our participants here today are a mix from government, implementing agencies, executing agencies, as well as civil society. About 20% are from outside the ADB network. A note that we will be using extensive use of SEAH as an acronym in English for sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and GBV as an acronym in English for gender-based violence. We ask both participants as well as translators to make use of these acronyms. In this consultation, Samantha Hung, Malika Shagozatova, and Dr. Zainab El-Bakri will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on SEAH. They will also present the relationship of this to the gender study that they presented last week, as they all pertain to the revision of the Safeguards Policy and its update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provision and implementation of the 2009 policy, as well as propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming revised policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards Policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, ADB is recording this session for the purpose of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. Please join us from a quiet, distraction-free area, remembering to turn off your microphone when not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked to unmute yourself and, if you wish, turn on your camera so that you can ask your question to the audience live. As we are all colleagues here, please be respectful to each other and to each other's views. Dr. El-Bakri and I will manage to keep time to ensure that we are within our schedule, which is about 2 hours for this session. At any point during this consultation, you may ask for IT support, which will be provided throughout the dialogue. You may ask for IT support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important Zoom buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your screen and select your preferred language. Please remember to press the mute original audio button so that you can clearly hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter. These instructions are on the infographic in the orange panel. For those of you listening in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu, if you feel that any of the speakers are speaking too fast and you would like us to slow down, you can ask the original speaker in English to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is 2 reverse arrows pointing to your left in white. This will allow us English speakers to know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button. This is to the right-hand side of your name. After you've clicked on More, click on the Rename button and then type in your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message in Zoom, ask a question, or pose feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in any of the languages we have available, click on the Smile icon or the Reactions button, again at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and then click on the Raise Hand emoji. When invited to do so by Dr. El-Bakri, to speak, unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon. Then, if you wish to do so, to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders, so let me refer you to the next set of slides, which provides ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I won't reread the slides, but just another reminder that these sessions will be recorded and documented and subsequently distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Should you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen or on the slide. If you have any issues or concerns on recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through the email address on the slide or that appears in the chat box. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks and provide a context for this SEAH and Safeguard study. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Secondly, Samantha Hung will provide a presentation on and an overview on how specifically the SEAH issues relate to the gender work and the policy imperatives being implemented by the ADB. This will frame the discussion on SEAH specifically and allow us to engage on issues of how SEAH can be considered in the Safeguards Policy Update. Samantha is Chief of Gender Equality of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. Thirdly, we will follow on from Samantha's presentation with a presentation by Malika Shagazatova, a social development specialist on gender and development in the ADB. Malika will detail some of the SEAH findings and key issues, including a comparator analysis and some of the performance standards and requirements and how these relate to the revision of the current safeguards policy and might be considered in the revised policy. After the presentations by Bruce, Samantha, and Malika, we will take a brief 5-minute break where I will ask you to think about some feedback on the presentations and these consultations in general, offering some advice and feedback on how the consultations and our engagement with you might be improved. Finally, when we return from the break and as a culmination of the previous presentations, we will have an open discussion on the SEAH issues raised in the presentations, as well as by the study summary paper, which has been emailed to all of pre-registered participants and available as a download from the various ADB websites, including the policy update website. This will be facilitated and moderated by Dr. Zainab El-Bakri, a senior consultant on gender and safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. A reminder that you may also ask your questions in Hindi, Urdu, Russian, and of course in English at any time and in the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions. Dr. El-Bakri will guide us with questions to frame the conversations for the discussions we will have. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and indicative next steps for the remainder of the consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the SEAH study. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and good day, welcome, and thank you so much to everyone for joining today's regional consultation on the topic of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH. SEAH, as you may hear us refer to it during the consultation. Now, for this session, we do have a mixed group. We have both members of governments, ADB developing member countries, as well as civil society organizations and other non-government stakeholders. So with quite a diverse participants today, we're looking for an interesting and diverse discussion. Now, this session actually builds on recent consultations. Last week, we ran sessions on the broader issue of gender and safeguards. These were very interesting sessions, and some of you may have joined those. In fact, I think many of you have either joined the consultations for gender last week or have joined previous consultations that we've been running actually since November last year for the safeguard policy update. So I'm not going to provide a lot of background today on the update of the safeguard policy, the process itself, because I think many of you will be quite familiar with that. I'll just say a few brief words, and then I will turn more to the topic of today's session. Now, firstly, as many of you know, we're in the process of updating the 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. So this is ADB's safeguard policy, now more than a decade old. We had an internal evaluation of the policy, which was published in May 2020. That then led us into a process to update the policy. We have been undertaking a series of analytical studies on different safeguard topics, and we've been feeding those into this regional consultation series. The feedback from these regional consultations with ADB developing member countries and with civil society organizations will, of course, be feeding into the new policy itself. And we're actually working towards a first draft of the policy and making that publicly available in about September or October this year. After that, we'll go into further consultations to get more detailed feedback. Now, With that as background, you'll be able to find some further information on the process in the chat box. We'll be dropping some information there for you in just a moment. Now, moving to today's topic on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment issues. This was actually one of the key issues that was identified as a gap in the existing ADB safeguard policy, a gap that the evaluation studies had identified, I should say. And it's also an issue where there has been increasing attention, I think globally, to the issues around sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, globally and also within our region. And as you will see in the upcoming presentation, my colleague, Samantha Hung, she's the chief of ADB's Gender Equality Thematic Group. She'll be presenting some further background, including on commitments that ADB has made to addressing risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in our own organization, as well as within the projects that ADB finances. To that end, we've already developed some enhanced internal codes of conduct and protocols for ADB, plus for our operations and financing, the team has actually recently developed a draft guidance note on addressing the risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And this is soon to be piloted in a number of countries in the region. But now looking ahead to the update of the safeguard policy, we're currently considering to have explicit requirements on how these issues should be considered in the context of the safeguard policy and how they should be integrated within various other standards. For example, around environmental and social assessment, or in terms of stakeholder consultation processes, community health and safety, or within grievance redress mechanisms for community members or for workers that may have faced sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment issues in the context of their work or in the context of the project implementation. So it's a very important topic, very important issue for us to look at in the context of the safeguard policy. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from you today with your views, any experiences that you have with your existing work within projects, if you're an ADB developing member country or executing agency that's been working with us, or more widely from civil society or local community members on the ground. This will help us to have further thoughts around the development of the policy and of course, how that could be implemented in practice. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and hearing from you. But before that, we have two short presentations for you. And the first one will be presented by Ms. Samantha Hung, Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group at ADB. So let me pass over to Samantha now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for the setting the scene, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and I look forward to the discussion. So as Bruce mentioned, if we could just move to the next slide. Thank you for that. So this session today should be seen in the context of our broader approach to integrating gender into the updated safeguards policy statement. And last week, we had 5 consultations actually looking at gender and safeguards broadly. So this week, starting with this session, we're zooming in particular on the subject of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH for short. So this needs to be seen in the context of ADB's overall commitment to advancing gender equality, and that advancing gender equality, or accelerating gender equality to be specific in our policy statement, is one of 7 operational priorities in our corporate strategy 2030. And within the operational plan for that priority of accelerating gender equality, we do commit going forward to taking steps to address project risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So today's session is really putting the focus on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH, within the context of safeguards, but it should also be seen in terms of our broader work on gender and supporting gender equality, and particularly in terms of how we address it through the updated safeguards policy statement. So it's in that context that I'll be talking about this particular background study, and then my colleague Malika will talk in more detail about the findings and what we're proposed going forward. If I could please go to the next slide. So just to say that, you know, we all try very hard to avoid using acronyms, but there are some acronyms that we might mistakenly say for short without addressing it. But just to say that when we mention SEAH, we are talking about SEAH, Sexual Exploitation, Abuse and Harassment. We will also be making lots of references to multilateral development banks. So sometimes we might say MDBs by mistake, but we'll try our best to spell out all the words so that it's easier for you to follow. So on this slide here, I just want to start by saying that ADB, the Asian Development Bank, along with other multilateral development banks, in April 2018 committed at a head of multilateral development banks meeting. So that's basically when the heads or presidents of all these banks meet on a regular basis. So in April 2018, when they met, ADB, along with 9 other organizations, confirmed their commitment to prevent sexual abuse, exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH, within their own institutions and in their operations. So a few months later, this was reaffirmed at an October 2018 Global Safeguarding Summit in London, and that was hosted by the UK government, at that time, the Department for International Development, or DFID, which is now part of the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, or SCDO. So this shared commitment at the highest leadership level of these multilateral development banks was to ensure creation of an environment in which sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment is rejected, but also active steps are taken to address the challenges faced in this regard. And this undertaking was to maintain and advance standards to prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment through several common principles. So there's 7 of them, and I will tell them to you one by one. So firstly, the commitment to foster a culture of respect and high standards of ethical behavior across institutions. Secondly, to establish and maintain standards aimed at preventing SEAH and other forms of misconduct. Thirdly, to provide a safe and trusted environment for those affected by sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment to step forward and report incidents and concerns. Fourthly, to provide protection for those that are affected, as well as whistleblowers or witnesses within institutions, and to take appropriate measures against any form of retaliation. Fifthly, to maintain robust policy frameworks and clear institutional mechanisms that address how incidents and allegations will be handled. Sixthly, to provide effective training programs so that all staff understand the requirements and expected standards of behavior. And lastly, 7th, to support our clients to develop and implement policies and mechanisms that address sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So as part of this shared commitment, ADB, alongside other multilateral development banks, we contribute to and participate in periodic joint reporting that is expected against this commitment. And the latest joint update report was submitted to the UK government in September 2021, last year. So this multilateral development bank joint commitment and work in strengthening our respective institutional and operational approaches to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment has also led to a deepened engagement, knowledge sharing, and operational collaboration amongst multilateral development banks. And actually, in November 2020, a dedicated working group on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment was formed amongst multilateral development banks for the purpose of collaboration and coordination between institutions whose at that time and still to this date have slightly different policies and procedures for addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So we are part of this working group, and actually myself and my colleague Malika, who you'll meet shortly, are part of this working group on behalf of the Asian Development Bank. And this working group focuses really on developing a knowledge sharing platform and opportunities to collaborate and jointly pilot initiatives, and specifically to explore country level collaboration around specific investments or areas. So the purpose really is to facilitate communication, share resources that each of us may develop, and really support the development of sharing of practical tools and training, particularly at country level. And really, we want to work towards country collaboration so that we can explore scope for piloting harmonized approaches through jointly developed interventions at country level wherever possible. So if I could please move on to the next slide. So as my colleague Bruce has mentioned, a 2019 Independent Evaluation Department report about ADB's safeguard policy statement noted, importantly, that the current safeguards policy lacks specific support on emerging issues such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, including in the worksite and in terms of broader project impacts on communities. So this report further noted that safeguarding against sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment cuts across environmental safeguards, health and safety, gender and social protection, and really calls for a more integrated approach that integrates analysis by safeguards and gender team to really enhance synergies and reduce duplication. The report further stressed the importance of the provision of operational guidance through the operational manual, good practice notes, training, and other tools for ADB staff and our partners and clients. And so in responding to this report, ADB management recognized that there are some gaps in emerging areas such as risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or SEAH, that need to be addressed. And it was also further noted that interim guidance on these areas can and should be developed prior to the update of the safeguards policy, because we have this interim period in between. ADB also recognizes that, handling and channeling of SEAH concerns and incident response through existing grievance redress mechanisms may not be appropriate due to the sensitivity of the issues and the particular confidentiality requirements. So it was really in this context that we decided, in the context of the SPS review, to conduct a benchmarking exercise to look at how sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment within the context of safeguards is addressed across our peer multilateral development banks and other institutions, so that we can really compare the adequacy of ADB's approach and recommend a way forward. If I could please move to the next slide. So with here then, I will explain the purpose and the scope and the methodology of the study on the next slide, please. So the main purpose and objective of this benchmarking study, as I mentioned, is really to compare ADB's current policies, strategies, and practices with that of other multilateral development banks. So as such, the study involved identifying gaps, strengths and weaknesses, as well as good practices, lessons learned, and emerging issues in addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, SEAH, from peer organizations. And in doing so, it also identified operational implications. The study was undertaken predominantly as a desk-based exercise and involved the review of key ADB, multilateral development bank, and other third-party documentation, as well as other resources, including that of the United Nations agencies, NGO organization reports, and some academic studies. The desk review was supplemented by some virtual interviews with ADB staff and also representative staff of our peer multilateral development banks. Going forward, the study will be further supplemented through consultations with developing member countries as well as civil society organizations. And today is one of those events where we really are looking forward to your feedback. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Maliki, from my team to present the study findings.
Thank you, Sam. It is my pleasure to present the findings of the benchmarking study. And as my colleagues, I'm also looking forward to upcoming discussion, your reactions to what we are presenting today. And we hope you can also share your experience and views on how ADB should move forward in addressing issues related to the risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in ADB financed projects. I will start my presentation with a quick summary on how SEAH, sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, is included in the current policies and practices of ADB. Under the current policy, safeguards are understood as seeking to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse environmental and social impacts, including protecting the rights of those who are likely to be affected or marginalized by development process. In environmental safeguards requirement 1, ADB sets out commitment to occupational and community health and safety. And while safeguards policy statement notes that there is a potential gender-related risks, it does not specifically refer to gender-based violence, nor to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. At the same time, we have a gender and development policy, which describes ADB vision on to do good. And this is done by investing in gender equality more widely and addressing female-focused violence specifically. The initial poverty and social assessment, or as we call it, IPSA, and relevant operation manuals broadly address adverse social and gender risks and require ensuring that the project designs maximize social benefits and avoid or minimize social risks, particularly those risks that are, for vulnerable and marginalized groups, and specifically target risks of human trafficking. Other relevant ADB strategies, such as social protection strategy, also indirectly addresses many risk factors, such as, for example, poverty, disability, or unemployment, which makes some groups more vulnerable to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. ADB Corporate Strategy 2030, which was approved in 2018, and it was mentioned by Sam, prioritize accelerating gender equality as one of 7 key operational priorities. And further, acknowledges that achieving gender equality is a necessary enabler for other strategic objectives under the Strategy 2030. We also have operational plan for priority 2, which specifically calls for assessing project risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and human trafficking in the context of measures for eliminating gender-based violence. As Sam mentioned in response to the report that was prepared by Independent Evaluation Department, ADB management recognized that there are some real gaps in risks related to gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and this needs to be addressed. But we also need to be mindful to make a distinction between compliance areas and aspirational goals. It was also noted that there is a value in developing interim guidance note on these areas prior to the SPS update. Let me now move to the key study findings. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in this benchmarking study, we compared the safeguards policies that were approved by Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Inter-American Development Bank, International Finance Corporation, and the World Bank. We specifically looked at provisions related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in safeguards policies across the standards and requirements. We also looked at use of risk assessment tools, specific risk assessment tool designed to identify risks related to sexual violence. We looked at availability of materials that would provide implementation support, and specific requirements related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in procurement. The key aspects covered in this study include the scope and application of respective multilateral development bank safeguard systems with respect to the risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, including relevant operational requirements that are applicable not just for the MDBs, for the multilateral development banks, but also to borrowers, executive and implementing agencies in our developing member countries, contractors, and clients. Next slide, please. So I will start with how SEAH is reflected in safeguards policies in different banks. So the benchmarking study found that multilateral development banks are using different approaches to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in their operations. Some MDBs have incorporated explicit provisions in their safeguard standards, both as standalone or across relevant standards. Others have developed tools, procedures, and recommendations through adoption of good practice note and other operational tools that can be used during the project design and implementation. Amongst MDBs, the Inter-American Development Bank has the most extensive gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related provisions. And the safeguards policy requires that borrowers should address gender-related risks, including gender-based exclusion and sexual and gender-based violence, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has an overall commitment to prevent and address any form of violence and harassment. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in their recently approved environmental and social framework, or ESF in short, this was approved basically last year in May 2021. So this revised ESF framework included an elevated importance on gender equality and commitment to addressing gender-based violence. The World Bank and International Finance Corporation, their safeguards policies do not specifically refer neither to gender-based violence nor to SEAH, to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, but this organization use other operational tools, which I will discuss in the next slides. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned, the second area was that we've been looking at how specific provisions related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment incorporated in performance standards and requirements. And here again, Inter-American Development Bank has the most comprehensive coverage with explicit mention of SEAH-related considerations, and they are included both across various standards, in addition to a standalone gender standard. And the requirements in the standards include requirements related to risk assessment at the project design. There are explicit requirements for contractor sexual harassment policies and code of conduct. There are requirements to do sensitization of workers and communities, and establishment of grievance redress mechanism for gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment specific cases. Sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment are also included in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development performance requirements, actually in two requirements. In performance requirement 2 on labor and working conditions, and performance requirement 4 on health, safety, and security. In Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, safeguards requirements, in Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, safeguards requirements, the gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related requirements included in Environmental and Social Standard 1, ESS 1, which looks at environmental and social assessment and management. And these requirements are looking at how borrowers can manage risks of project-related gender-based violence, and looking at both gender-based violence that can be occurred to project-affected person and communities and project workers. Next slide. So MDBs are also including specific provisions in the guidance materials that developed and approved for implementation support. As I mentioned earlier, the World Bank does not specifically refer to GBV and SEAH, although identification of gender impacts are required. At the same time, the World Bank has well-developed, it's quite well-established operational tools for identifying sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks. And the World Bank also issued a good practice note on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in projects with large infrastructure works. It was first published in 2018, and it was updated in 2020 based on the lessons learned from implementation. The World Bank requires use of project risk screening tool to determine the level of risks related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And it requires to include appropriate and proportionate mitigation measures, which has to also take into account both the risk screening and rating from the tool that is used, but also it requires inputs from community consultations as part of the environment and social assessment. The World Bank has further strengthened a couple of years ago contractors' accountability through procurement requirements, and it's actively guiding borrowers in the assessment of bidders' responsiveness and competence to comply with specific sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related obligations during the bid evaluation process. Attention to sexual violence is incorporated into the whole project cycle in the World Bank. And it goes starting with the use of the risk assessment tool. It includes requirements for stakeholder engagement, specific requirements for contractors' code of conduct, and SEAH-specific requirements in procurement and grievance mechanism and reporting. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development also applies risk screening tool to determine the level of SEAH risks that are specific to project, and bank requires appropriate and proportionate mitigation measures to be included to address this risk. International Finance Corporation, in collaboration with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, jointly developed and published a practical guidance for private sector operations. The title of this guidance is Addressing Gender-Based Violence and Harassment, Emerging Good Practices for the Private Sector. That can be easily found, it's published and it can be found in the internet for the use by the private sector. Next slide, please. So this slide provides high-level comparative summary of findings of approaches that are used by different multilateral development banks and donors funds to address sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. It shows that although each of these organizations that are included in this slide may have a slightly varied approach, addressing is in how they are addressing SEAH. But it also important to it also shows that SEAH is increasingly on the agenda of all organizations. Next slide. So the key study findings. The benchmarking study found overall that ADB is potentially at risks of falling behind other peer MDBs in terms of the existence of established approaches. And at this point in time, we do not have systems in place which are designed to specifically identify mitigate, and respond to project-related risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, both including to worker-to-worker and worker-to-community impacts. Risks that related to sexual violence are also not explicitly identified in the current safeguards policy as a consideration in project screening and categorization. In addition, any sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment related incidents, should they arise, would currently be handled through existing complaints, reporting, sorry, I'm losing, hello? Hello?
We hear you.
Okay,
sorry. We can hear you, yeah.
I'm sorry, my system is crashing. Just 1 second, give me 1 second.
Malika, are you there? If not, I can step in if necessary.
Sam, can you hear me?
Yeah, my
computer is crashing. Sorry. Can you just step and then I'll just reconnect?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No problem. We can actually hear you. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. This is the technology that we deal with. So if we could just continue, I might just slightly backtrack a little bit to pick up. So back to this slide. So I think Malika was saying that the study found overall that compared to other multilateral development banks, we are actually at risk of falling behind our peers in terms of having an established approach to addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. I think that someone might have their, yeah, that's better. I think there was someone unmuted, so there was a bit of noise. Thank you for muting. So at this point in time, as Malika explained, the Asian Development Bank does not have systems in place that are designed specifically to identify, mitigate, and respond to project-related risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, including worker-to-worker and worker-to-community impacts. And as we've explained before, SEAH-related risks are not explicitly identified in the current safeguards policy statement as a consideration in terms of how we currently screen or categorize projects. So that means that if we are to be made aware of an incident of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, if that were to arise, currently we would have to handle them through our existing complaints, reporting, and redress mechanisms. And while that would be a way to handle it, these mechanisms are not specifically designed for the purpose of dealing with this kind of case. And with that, we mean it doesn't necessarily, our existing mechanisms don't necessarily have, provide for due consideration to be given to the particular sensitivity, confidentiality, and survivor-centered approaches, which are really important for good practice in handling sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment allegations and cases. So furthermore, in the absence of a common multilateral development bank good practice standards and requirements, this can actually lead to challenges where we have co-financing of particular projects, or it could relate to lead to different transaction costs for our borrowers or partners and clients. So we think that going forward, consistent approaches and requirements in terms of the procurement, reporting, and service provision for sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment would make it easier for multilateral development banks to be able to collaborate on projects at country level, which would then increase efficiency and coherence. If we could move to the next slide. And Malika, if you're back on, please just let me know. I'll continue until I hear from you. So on the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I think was mentioned right at the outset from Bruce, in the interim period to address the lack of guidance related to addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, ADB has been in the process of developing and finalizing a good practice note on addressing SEAH in ADB finance projects with civil works. And this good practice note is developed with the intent to support our staff, our borrowers, the staff of our partner executing and implementing agencies, as well as contractors, in order to design measures to address SEAH in ADB finance projects. So the good practice note is not policy, and the recommendations it provides are advisory in nature, as the title Good Practice Note implies. Application of recommendations in this Good Practice Note is proposed to be piloted in selected developing member countries to new projects that have infrastructure development components and civil works within their ambit. The Good Practice Note is designed based on guiding principles which are in line with international good practice for handling SEAH. So let me start and highlight maybe 3 of them in particular. All 7 of them are highlighted in that visual diagram on the slide, but I can highlight 3 of them. So firstly, the principle of shared responsibility. In order to deal effectively with sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, actions really require collaboration and commitment amongst ADB staff, consultants, contractors, borrowers, and executing and implementing agencies. Okay, I see Malika's back, so maybe I will just finish these 3 good practice, and then I can hand back to you, Malika. So secondly, it's very important that a survivor-centered approach as a core principle is taken into account when addressing SEAH. And this means that it's important to always prioritize the needs and the rights of any survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And thirdly, the principle of proportionate action, meaning that measures taken to tackle SEAH should be proportionate to the project-related risks, the existing country frameworks that might be in place to deal with this issue, as well as executing and implementing agency policies and practices that may be in place. So the Good Practice Note outlines responsibilities for incorporating, implementing, monitoring, and reporting on SEAH-related measures, templates, and what we call minimum good practice standards that can be used by counterpart staff and contractors to develop their own effective approaches and systems to tackle sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment during project design and implementation. So with that, if Malika is with us, are you with us, Malika? I will hand back to you to continue on the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Sam, and my sincere apologies. Sometimes, yes, and this was my computer reacting on, I think, too many messages are coming. So this is the last slide. And here we will discuss the key issues for further consideration and consultation. The benchmarking exercise highlighted several gaps in ADB policies, practices, and resources. When we compared our current provisions to those that are used by peer MDBs with regard to SEAH in the context of safeguards. And these are the following key issues that are proposed based on the benchmarking study. We think that it's important that consideration will be given to an integrated project risk classification system and integrated environmental and social impact assessment to avoid a siloed approach, as well as to consider other social and gender risks, including the risks that related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Incorporation of contextual risks in project risk categorization should also take into account country and project-specific factors, such as, for example, country level of prevalence of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, existing country-level legal frameworks, and most importantly, how they actually implemented, and gender norms that might also normalize gender-based violence or violence against women. Project-specific factors should include risks associated with labor influx, project categorization on resettlement, on indigenous people and environment, if the project will use military or private security forces, or it will be operated in a fragile and small island context. All these factors may interfere and amplify risks of gender-based violence and sexual violence. And use of risk-based approach would require development of corresponding risk assessment tools that will help to inform proportionate approaches to address sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in project design. And also it will help us to include specific provisions for procurement, strengthening capacity of project implementing and executive agencies to ensure that the support and implementation of mitigation and response measures are done properly. So the second point is that we need to consider SEAH as a cross-cutting issue across standards for community and occupational health and safety and in labor and working conditions. And this will help us to cover SEAH risks in worker-to-worker and worker-to-community nexus. This would require more detailed discussion of specific provisions and requirements for safeguarding against sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks, and how they can be included in the updated standards. Further review will be needed on the possible coverage of SEAH in the new standards, and it should be done based on the comparative analysis and also implementation experience and lessons learned from comparator multilateral development banks, as well as more detailed discussion with our executive and implementing agencies in the developing member countries. The third is we need to include more customized grievance redress mechanism in stakeholder engagement and disclosure policy standard. And this should include proportionate measures to respond to potential risks of sexual violence, sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and impacts of projects. This should be customized in a culturally appropriate way for different types of affected people, including survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. But we also need to keep in mind that use of traditional dispute resolution methods that are often kind of proposed as an alternative for SEAH-specific cases are strongly discouraged. Fourth, it is important to understand that additional due diligence requirements may emerge due to deeper coverage that will be mandated as a part of the compliance, mandated through the performance standard approach. And technical and financial resources may be required to cover the expanded thematic safeguards and cross-cutting gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks in labor and working conditions and community health and safety. This may result in increased due diligence requirements for our borrowers. And although this is based on our discussion with other MDBs, the extent of additional requirements may vary between countries. This is something that we need to keep in mind when we are doing updates for the safeguards policy. There may be also efficiencies which can be gained through the greater harmonization and coordination with other MDBs operating at country level. And as Asian Development Bank adopts a new model, there may be a risk to project processing time increasing if additional resources are not invested in the design, monitoring, and supervision of project safeguards. As well as we have to keep in mind that there will be needs for capacity building to address the gaps if we are to apply expanded thematic areas such as gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So to address these, a transition period for at least 1 year will be needed before revised policy effectiveness. The next area is the development of SEAH guidance, notes, and tools. And this is very much in line with the MDB's, with other multilateral development banks' experience in introducing safeguarding measures against sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And this will be important if we want to bring Asian Development Bank on par with peer multilateral development banks. So it is recommended that in parallel of the ongoing work on review and update of the current safeguards policy, we also need to, and the development of the standards, we also need to develop, approve, and pilot, say, a good practice note on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in ADB finance project with civil works. The importance of this pilot is that it would allow us for trial of operational approaches in addressing risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, as well as building capacity. Will give us time to build capacity of our stakeholders, borrowers, executive and implementing agencies, as well as strengthen capacity of ADB staff during this pilot period. The good practice note can then be updated following the pilot to reflect lessons learned, and also according to the emerging good practices. It is also recommended to develop a toolkit to provide further guidance to our partners, executive and implementing agencies, and also contractors on how to establish grievance redress mechanism, case handling, and reporting that is specifically tailored to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment incidents. The next area for further consideration is how we can strengthen expertise on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment through addressing gaps in staffing within ADB and ensuring access to specialized training programs. And one of the suggestions is that we have to strengthen our partnership with the peer MDBs on safeguards training and capacity building, both for our own staff and for our developing member countries. And this can assist in building capacity of country-level stakeholders and have us more harmonized approaches and understanding on the risks and mitigation measures and how this can be included in the project design. And last but not least, we understand that there might be increase in technical assistance resources, the needs for increase in technical assistance resources, and this will be needed to support expanded SEAH-related project safeguards, due diligence process, and also to strengthen borrower capacity. And further assessment of these issues, including costs and needs on the country level, this needs to be undertaken through the next stages of the SPS update process. So in the meantime, ADB will be providing additional technical resources to support rollout the pilot that I already mentioned. With this, I'll finish my presentation, and we are looking forward to discussion, questions, suggestions, and your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malika, and thank you also, Samantha. And these presentations were extremely comprehensive and detailed, and we're all very grateful to the wonderful overviews on the sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, as well as the gender-based violence issues that you've both raised for us all to consider. These presentations offer us considerable clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by the ADB's IED publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March of 2023. The comparative analyses on SEAH that were presented by Malika and need to be considered in how the ADB becomes a leader in incorporating sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, as well as gender-based violence issues in the revised safeguards policy is absolutely essential. And we hope that we can get to feedback and an opportunity to discuss and delve into some of these issues during the discussions arising from this forthcoming Q&A session. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. As I mentioned, we hope we can get further feedback from you, the stakeholders, on what ADB should consider in these general policy topics during the facilitated Q&A session. This session will run for about 70 to 75 minutes, but there is some flexibility in that. And just to note that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please click on the participants list and select sending the message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, who are members of the team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question under their name to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. Let's now pause for a 5-minute break. Before I do, you will see that there are some guide questions being flashed on the screen. These guide questions are only indicative and will help us structure the discussion and conversation. But we also are looking forward to the feedback of your experiences and your personal accounts of how you've experienced different issues during field preparation or field work or implementation of activities in the field as an ADB implementing agency, executing agency, or contractor. At the same time, while we're taking the break, may I please encourage you to think about how these consultations have benefited you and your overall level of satisfaction with these consultations and what the ADB can do to improve the levels of engagement with you. We'd like to hear from you on a number of polls that will be coming up after the consultation, but for now, we're going to pause for a 5-minute break. If you see on the top right-hand corner of the screen, there's a 5-minute countdown timer. As that timer approaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens. If you've left your screen and can't see it or your device, you will hear some background music playing, and as that background music begins to fade, you'll know that it's time to quickly return to your screens. So we look forward to a facilitated Q&A session as facilitated by Dr. Zainab Al-Bakri after our brief 5-minute break, and we will leave these guide questions on the screen for you to consider during the break. So with that, we will see you all very shortly. Thanks very much and welcome back, everybody. We will now have the Q&A discussion as facilitated by Zainab El-Bakri, a consultant to the ADB. During the break, you will have seen some questions, some guide questions flashed on the screen. And I think the next slide will have the questions once again. But as I mentioned, feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve SEAH and GBV issues in the revision of the previous safeguards policy statement as aligned to ADB Strategy 2030 and the OP2, which Samantha and Malika both mentioned. A reminder that you can also ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen in, of course, English, but also through chat in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu. And a further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please select sending the message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, who are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question under their name to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. And then we will have a quick event evaluation or a series of event evaluations before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and indicative next steps following the consultation. But for now, let me turn it over to Zainab El-Bakri for the Q&A session. Zainab, if you please.
Hi, well, welcome again to everybody. We look forward to receiving questions, comments, advice, experiences related to the presentation that was just made. It's a very interesting topic and of course, very new topic for all institutions, not only for ADB. So looking forward to hearing from you. I see one hand, Ms. Mariam Balavadze. Am I correct? And please go ahead. Okay, I think let me go then to another participant who also raised a question. I'll read out the question. The question is will SEAH fall under the environmental safeguards responsibilities office? Will the responsibility for SEAH fall under the responsibility of environmental safeguards officers, or will there be need to recruit a new specialist or staff specifically to handle SEAH? Can either Malika or Samantha respond? Actually, we have another hand, so why don't we take this question first, and then we can hear from. Please go ahead, Qazi.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Qazi Baby from Bangladesh. Yeah, so we are actually working on sexual harassment, child sexual abuse and exploitation. And in Bangladesh, you know, we are working with the poor people, poor slum dwellers. So there are many cases happen, sexual abuse, sexual harassment. And we have some women leaders, those who are working on this issue. But I am wondering actually the ADB in our country, we heard that mainly ADB is working on constructional matter. So this is sexual abuse, it is a social issue. So why ADB is interested to work on this issue? And can we actually make partnership with them? Because we have experience on this issue. So this is my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Qazi, can you say who you are, please?
I am Qazi Baby from PDAP, Bangladesh. Actually, it's a women-based organization, participatory development action program, and we are working with the women groups, women, men, and grassroots women those who are living in slum dwellers and rural area and poor community. So we are working with them, but there are many sexual harassment happening in the slum area and poor community, but they do not get the real support from any organization. And also, you know, Bangladesh government also try to help this issue, but it is socially, actually, the people avoid it because they think that if they say that if the girl or boys are sexually abused, it will be society will not accept it. So that's why it is just hiding. Uh, that's why I'm telling that how we can overcome this situation, and is there any process that ADB can help through financial support or any project, through any project that so that we can help the poor people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have another 2 questions from Sarah. Would you like to actually present your questions, or shall I just go ahead and read them?
Yes. Hi, Zainab. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for a very informative session. I have been following various sessions, and every session is really very informative, and it shows the background process which ADB is making in creating a sufficient significant efforts updating the safeguard policy. Particularly to this SEAH discussion, I have been involved in the other consultations as well, where SEAH and GBV risk has been identified in different projects, that what ADB is doing, how they are contributing, and how they are tackling. So my 2 questions at this moment is that, first of all, ADB currently, how they are covering the SEAH concept in their ongoing projects, because some of the projects that I have been reviewing, so the SEAH concept was totally missed. So is there any uniform procedure or guidelines which is implemented on all projects, either it's related to infrastructure, education, and any sector? So is there any particular guidelines that covers the standard format?
Okay, thank you. Sarah, can I go back to Sam or Malika to answer these questions, and then we can get more questions? I think most of the questions really relate to procedures and future proposals by ADB, whether there will be need to recruit new specialists, and how is ADB currently covering SEAH issues, in addition to what are the kinds of additional due diligence that will be required to be able to deal with the issue of SEAH. Can I go back to Sam maybe to answer some of these queries?
Sure. Thank you very much, Zainab, and thank you everybody for the questions. I hope you keep them coming. So I will give an initial response, and then I'm sure Malika and maybe even Bruce might want to supplement. So first of all, on the issue of staffing. So as was explained, because we currently don't have a policy in place, I mean, on SEAH, and we just are at the stage of developing a good practice note, which is in final stage, and we plan to pilot it. At the moment, our resourcing is mostly in terms of consultants that have been brought on to help us develop the approach. And when we pilot it, we will also be supporting a national consultant in each of the pilot countries. And we also have a staff member that's an international staff that's currently being recruited in my team. So that is a new position which will focus on SEAH, a SEAH specialist, basically, to help us roll out our approach and our good practice note pilot in the interim period, because as we are having this consultation, SEAH is not yet explicitly in our safeguards policy. going forward, if it were to be picked up as part of our safeguards policy, then yes, it would become an issue that becomes on the radar of safeguard specialists as well as anyone working on an ADB project. But depending on the level of risk, the level of attention to the issue would depend on the level of risk that is determined for that project. In the longer term, yes, we may need to look at resourcing of additional staff positions that are more specialized, but at this stage, that's not yet in place. To answer the question about, I think, Sarah, about ongoing projects. So, I mean, following on to my earlier response, given that it is not yet policy, we don't yet have a systematic approach to assessing project risk of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, or of necessarily how to deal with it. And so that is why when you said you haven't seen a lot of it in project documents, it's because it's not yet part of the prescribed approach. That doesn't mean that it is not considered at all. In some projects where the gender analysis has found sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks to be there, there have been some proactive measures put into place through the gender designs to address the issue, but it's not come at it from a safeguards angle per se, because it's not explicitly part of the policy. And perhaps Malika, when she comes in, can give some examples of how we are already addressing SEAH in a more proactive way. The focus of this consultation is around sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment as a particular form of gender-based violence that we're focused on in the context of safeguards. But that doesn't mean broadly ADB does do other work to address gender-based violence more broadly through our broader programming. Then I think the last question I'll touch on is in terms, I think Kazi Baby, thank you. You're from the organization that works in slums, I think in Bangladesh. Thank you for your question. So what we are proposing going forward through a good practice note and potentially in our updated safeguards is to have a more intentional approach to deal with sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment risks at project level. So why? I think you asked the question, if I understood correctly, why is ADB doing this? Well, there's several parts to the answer. As explained, we've made a commitment at the highest level of our organization, along with other multilateral development banks, to address this issue in a more thorough manner. But I think most importantly, the reason why we want to pay more attention to this issue is because we don't want, as a result of any of ADB finance projects, for people or communities that are affected to be put at increased risk of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment because of unintended effects. And that is why we want to make sure that we have measures in place to assess the risk of any project of this happening and to be able to respond to it if there was an incident. So going forward, as we roll out a pilot approach at country level, part of that pilot approach will be getting a better understanding of the available services and organizations in country so that we do a mapping exercise, because part of the response will be being able to refer survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment to the necessary services if such an incident, we were made aware of such an incident. So I guess organizations like yourselves or other organizations would be part of our mapping of what services are available in the given context. So with that, I will hand over to Malika and maybe others if they would like to jump in. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sam. Maybe I will just continue on the discussion that you already started. We also, while developing a good practice note and the piloting approaches, we're also closely been looking at SEAH-related risks that might be specific to the country context and to the project context. And in terms of the country context, we are well aware that our developing member countries are currently at very different stages on developing approaches on how to address gender-based violence or sexual violence. And most probably we'll also have to provide support through policy dialogue, through the technical assistance to build this capacity and also to strengthen the existing legal frameworks that are already in place or that needs to be enhanced or need to be developed. I think in one of the consultations last week, one of our participants asked, what are we doing and how are we collaborating with ILO on the Convention 190 that specifically covers violence and harassment in world of works. And this is something like we need also to keep in mind that, worldwide, only 14 countries that actually ratified this convention. And among our DMCs, it's only one. So it means that more long-term efforts would be required and support would be required to raise an awareness, understanding and support from our government partners. And we also understand that even in the countries where the legal framework's in place, there are challenges in terms of enforcing laws. And these are the challenges that limit women and girls' access to safety and justice. As Sam mentioned, the engagement with women's machinery and women's organization is very important, both during the project design, but also during project implementation. So one of the risk factors that we are one of the group of risk factors that we are considering in terms of evaluating project risks on sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, they need to come from the direct consultations with the women organizations and women's groups. And this is specific to the ways on how we can collect information. There is a direct advice that during the project due diligence, we cannot seek for direct inputs from survivors of sexual violence, and we have to basically consult with a women's organization. I think there is a lot of work for us to ensure that we have organizations in place with whom we can collaborate in this area. And also, as I mentioned, in terms of implementation, understanding the available services that are in place, ensuring that the service providers' capacities are meeting the good practice standard, that will be one of our priority areas as a multilateral development bank, but also for other MDBs. And this is part of our discussion, because based on the experience from the Intra-American Development Bank and from the World Bank, this is the key area that most of our banks are struggling, because in some projects, like in some countries in the project area, availability of service providers are very limited. Yep, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam and Malika. We have two additional questions. There's one question from Varna Numanova. Do you want to come in, or shall I just read out the question? Varna? Okay, let me read out the question. The question is, yes, please come in.
Thank you, Malika Sagazatova, for this informative presentation. How will the presentation be reflected in the socio-economic life of the countries?
Okay, can you introduce yourself, Varna?
I'm Varna Numanova. I'm working for Ministry of Republic of Uzbekistan.
Okay, thank you. And can we now go to Vivek? Okay, thank you. I see also a question from Vivek Kumar. Vivek?
No, ma'am, there isn't a question from me. Sorry.
Vivek, did you have a question?
No, ma'am, there is no question from my side.
Oh, okay, that's fine. We have also a follow-up from Kwazi, who is asking whether there are any specific project formats or guidelines. So can we go back to Sam and Malika to answer these two questions? What is the impact of working on SEAH on people's lives? I mean, and on people, I guess, who will be impacted by ADB projects, and then whether there are specific guidelines or project formats at the moment. Sam?
I was going to suggest maybe Malika would like to take this.
Malika, yes. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, maybe I'll start with question from Barno. I think as a multilateral development bank, supporting development agenda of our developing member countries, we have to be mindful to ensure that vulnerable and disadvantaged groups are not negatively impacted by our operations. So to the questions on how the work on prevention, mitigation, and responding to SARD will have an impact on the broader life of people, I would say people would feel safe. There will be more opportunities for reporting and responding to the risks. And the most importantly, I think the use of survivor-centered approach, which puts needs and priorities of survivor in the center. And this survivor-centered approach, this is kind of core for the whole agenda on addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. That will be also addressed through our policy dialogue, through our capacity building activities, and through awareness raising among our counterparts and executive and implementing agencies, who will be our key focal points to monitor that there is a proper implementation from contractors. So the overall objective is to ensure that women and girls and boys and men who are potentially at risk of sexual violence, they will feel safer. And the next question was on the project format, if there is any project format or guidelines. As Sam mentioned in the, when I was dropped from the call, we are in process of finalizing a good practice note. And this good practice note, it's not a policy, it provides recommendations, and recommendations are provided both to Asian Development Bank staff, to our borrowers, to staff of executive and implementing agencies, on what type of measures and how these measures can be incorporated throughout the project design, during implementation, and for reporting. So the good practice note will be, after approval, it will be made available, it will be published, it will be made available. We are also discussing that it should be translated to at least the languages of the countries where it will be piloted. And there will be another forthcoming good practice note that specifically will be talking about how the grievance redress mechanisms need to be established on the country level. And these grievance redress mechanisms are basically those that are managed by contractors, that are monitored by executive and implementing agencies, and then ADB will provide support that it's implemented properly. Thank you.
Thank you. Malika, maybe can you say a word on the legal frameworks and how support will happen there?
Yes, thank you, Zainab. And this is when we talk about legal frameworks, this is also touching upon this aspirational type of work, which is usually addressed through our Strategy 2030 operational priority 2 related activities. This is part of the broader dialogue with the governments, and we already have experience, on ADB side when we are bringing this agenda, raising the issues that are related to broader concept of the umbrella concept of gender-based violence, and how this is incorporated in not just in laws, because most of the countries have quite clear laws that are talking about the gender-based violence and violence against women and against women and girls, but on the policies and how this being implemented. We also have several activities that are done across our developing member countries that are supported through technical assistance. For example, in Mongolia, we are quite actively working with the government and women's machinery on strengthening responses to gender-based violence, both in urban and rural area, ensuring that women in difficult situations have access to shelters, have access to hotlines, including during the period of, for example, in the last 2 years. And this was like kind of proactively, but this is again, these are not the compliance related areas. This is not something that triggered by the development project, but it's more of the broader development context and our work with the government partners. Thank you.
Thanks, Malika. Do we have any more questions from participants? Since we don't have any questions right now, can we go back to the questions that we posted on the screen earlier? Maybe those will trigger some ideas. The last slide that was provided. Can we go back to that slide, please? Jennifer, can you help us out here? Thank you. Okay, so can I ask the participants to look at these questions and indicate to us maybe whether you have any additional questions, or whether some of these you would like to be maybe answered more specifically? We saw several participants from Armenia, from the Ministry of Labor, and also from the Armenian State University. Does anybody from these participants wants to come in and pose specific questions related to the presentation? Okay, I mean,
I think Sarah has her hand up at the moment.
Okay, yes, Sarah, please.
Yeah, hi Zainab. I just have, so I would like to share some of my experience from the ADB projects with everyone regarding the challenges that what are some elements or challenges of the enabling environment, institutional and otherwise, for ensuring implementation of SEAH related requirements is part of the safeguard policy. As I work both in planning and stages as well as in implementation side, so I would like to share something from my experience that usually in the implementation side, there is a lack of support from the government as well as acceptability of the community regarding the SEAH related issues to discuss and disclose. Like I noticed that one of the explanation, Malik also said that we cannot directly contact the GBV survivors are Shia affected people. So we need to identify the organizations, those who are actively working in those areas for documenting those risks. But there is very less welcome for the discussion, and we can say for the discussion as well as solution of these types of risks. Usually in communities, it has been either suppressed, that no one should talk about it, it should not be discussed, it should not be resolved. Actually, the one who is victim is just victim by default, and so and so. So the thing is that there is a need of counseling and proper training and consultation before a project is piloted in a particular region, so that to create an enabling environment for the community as well as for the institution, for the relevant government agencies, that see if such type of sheer risks will be properly identified and resolved in a project. So it will be very good for the life cycle of the project. Secondly, it should also be dealt with the prevailing practices of that particular region. Like in all areas, the government and the legal rules regulation doesn't work. In most of the areas like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and all these regional countries, the sheer risks has been resolved with the community elders and jirga type of setting. So that is also very good, but we need to identify and give them a room to resolve those issues at their own traditional norms and traditional ways. So there has been always challenges if IDB projects, the project implementers and basically the project design team, they should identify that what are the prevailing practices, and to make more enabling environment, the existing practices should be welcome, and then we can integrate our own processes and our own standards in that prevailing practice. So it will give us more easy environment to implement our rules, regulations, our guidelines regarding Shia. So this is something from my experience that usually there is very less welcome for discussion and resolution of such issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Saira. That's very helpful. Yeah. Do we have any additional comments or questions? And also, I'm asking participants to look at the questions that we have on the screen.
Zainab, maybe I'll just respond quickly, because Sarah raised like really good point in terms of the use of the existing mechanisms and the existing existing practices to address them. And this is like something that I mentioned in the in my presentation, and just want maybe further to elaborate on this. If we look at data, like global data, which is available, which all organizations that are involved in this work also saying that the level of underreporting is really high. But if we look at the data that is available, then only 7% of survivors of gender-based violence, and probably those who are survivors of sexual violence, it will be even lower. So only 7% report the incident to a formal case, through a formal reporting mechanisms. And various studies highlight that reporting sexual violence allegations remain so low because many victims and survivors they don't believe that it will change something. They don't want resolution, right? So there is a great fear of embarrassment. So when you use the local established systems, then there is a risk that more people will know that the sexual violence happened to you. And very often people decide not to report to avoid this embarrassment. There are also huge concerns related to confidentiality. And if people who are receiving the report and handling the reports are not trained properly, then the risks of the confidentiality breach is very high. And this is why this, all the global good practices are kind of recommending, the use of the local mechanism to settle that like settlement, are discouraged to be applied for specific cases that are related to sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you. As we wait for other questions, sorry, I just wanted to recount a particular experience from a World Bank project where the issue also was making sure that the existent grievance redress mechanism is equipped to deal with these types of grievances and specific issues, because they are quite specific. I mean, what happened in that particular project, this was a road project, there were complaints being received by the accountability mechanism of the World Bank that there were cases of sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and violence. But then what the World Bank did was they just went into the community. They held a meeting where both men and women were present and asked, has anybody been subjected to gender-based violence? But of course, nobody raised their hand. But I think later on what happened was that they managed to create a special grievance redress mechanism that would handle these issues and would give confidence to people that confidentiality would be maintained. So I think one of the issues also that needs to come up is how is the specific GRM going to be designed to allow people and to give them confidence to come out and report. And I think that's one area where probably the GPN should be looking on how to design these grievance redress mechanisms. I just thought I'd put my 2 cents in there. Any other questions? Do we have any other questions? I don't see any other questions being raised.
Hi Zainab, just one short question I have with from Malika, that Malika responded actually to this point that people usually don't discuss due to the embarrassment that they have due to these issues when it is discussed and tried to be resolved and all these. So what can be the best approach while dealing with such issues, whether we should welcome the community prevailing practices? Still the noise of those issues will be like created, and even if it is taken through a GRM system that you give the World Bank example, so then again the team will be involved, and then there will be certain people that if want to provide a justice to the victim, so of course it would be. So based on that, whether people are not interested to have justice, or like I'm a little bit want to have more clarity as per your experience, because you have more experience than me and involved in more consultations and country level specific discussions, that what can be the suitable practice from the community perspective, that whether it should be reported, resolved or not, because the risk of leakage of information is in every modality that we adopt.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is a very risky process. So we have a question from Sona. Will there be a special GRM at the project level, at the project or at the government level to be established? Can I go back to Malika or Sam on that question, please?
Yes, thank you. And maybe just on the follow-up question from Saira, the use of survivor-centered approach is the key component, right? And we need to ensure that the confidentiality followed, and this has to be done through the standard operational procedures that will be required to be in place, both at the contractor level, who will be managing one of the layers of the grievance redress mechanism, but also within the executive and implementing agencies. When I was talking, the resolvement, if the survivor who raised the concern decides not to proceed with the following up steps, like doesn't want to file the official case, then it should be, the decision should be in favor to follow the request and wishes of the survivors. So the good practice note, which is still in the process of finalization, clearly states that the moment organization receives the complaints, the first thing we need to do, we need to assess the risks for survivor, and we need to refer survivor to service providers. And this has to be done on the priority level, on the priority, and as a priority action, and they should be done within 24 hours. So basically, if survivor needs urgent medical attention, this has to be organized through the grievance redress mechanism. And only after that, the discussion will be on what are the next steps. And if survivor decides to take the steps or not. So if survivor decides to, to report to police, then the legal support can be provided. But if survivor said, no, there is too much embarrassment, I don't want to do this because I'm afraid, or I don't want, it's a very small community, then the survivor's wishes has to be respected. About the question on the grievance redress mechanism, as we mentioned, that given the sensitivity, the grievance redress mechanism need to be adjusted. We are now in the process of development of a good practice note on GRM, on grievance redress mechanism, case handling and reporting. And we've been discussing with other multilateral development banks on their practices. For example, World Bank requires basically 4 grievance redress mechanisms, with one of them being specifically addressing SEAH-related concerns. So we are proposing like 3 different approaches. One approach, and this should be really depending on the risks that are associated with the projects. The higher risks, that more attention needs to be paid. And there are 3 approaches. One is adjusting the existing grievance redress mechanisms, but putting in place the standard operational procedures that would help to address SEAH-related reporting following confidentiality requirements. The second one is to establish standalone grievance redress mechanism, which only deals with the SEAH. And the third one is that if there are opportunity to use other grievance redress mechanisms like that are already in place, and so one of the examples could be from the project that we are working now here in the Philippines, where we're using the woman desk in woman desk in the LGU in the local government unit. We ensure that the training is provided and they understand what are the steps need to be taken if the case been reported. So these are the 3 options, and these options will be decided, as I mentioned, based on the risk of the project, based on close consultations with local communities and women's organizations in place, because again, we need to understand what is the very specific project area content we will be working in. I hope this answered question, or you can ask and I'll try to elaborate more. Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions on this very interesting presentation so far? We have about 10 minutes or so left. Does anybody want to come in at this point?
Actually, I just wanted to mention that we are working with the women-based women, with the grassroots women. So if you think that you need any information from the women organization, so you can provide it. If ADB thinks, because we are 25 years, we are working with the women, poor people. And also we are working sexual harassment, child sexual abuse, and vulnerable women in the community. Just if you know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Kwazi, for that additional comment. So at this point, if we don't have any other questions or queries, I'd like to thank both Sam and Malika, and I'll hand over to Azim.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zainab. And apologies, I was on mute. But I'd like to thank you all for your various contributions, your interventions, the sharing of experiences. A special thanks to you, Zainab, for facilitating the Q&A, and then to, excuse me, Samantha Hung, Malika Shagazatova, Bruce, others that were perhaps working behind the scenes that we didn't hear on screen or live, including Madhu Gupta and Oliver Chapman, as well as those from the events management and SEP teams who worked behind the scenes. But of course, we were in listening mode. So a special thanks to all of you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, the constructive feedback, all of which were very, very much appreciated. And I want to reiterate that the comments on this particular study in Asia and the Pacific that are received will hereafter be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standard and the updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go yet. On your screen, you will see a Zoom poll being flashed up. And the purpose of that poll is to give us an understanding of how well we did in responding to your issues, how satisfied you are with this overall level of consultation. And then I'm going to direct you to 2 further links that appear in the chat box that you can fill out at your leisure at some point in the future. But for now, if we could get an understanding of your initial impression on your level of satisfaction from this particular poll, from this particular consultation, ranking us from a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied to 1 being the least satisfied. The question is this: how satisfied are you with today's consultation on sexual exploitation and harassment, as well as gender-based violence? If you could quickly give us your impulsive reaction on a scale of 1 to 5, we would like to quickly relay that back to you and the rest of the audience and stakeholders assembled here today, so that others can know how you felt and you can know how they felt on the level of satisfaction for today's discussion and consultation. And then later, at your own discretion, at your own leisure, we have 2 additional polls. One is a Menti.com poll, which we are asking this particular question: how can we improve the level of engagement with you? How can we consult better? What have we done well? What do we need to improve on? If you can give us 3 or 4 or 5 sentences to give us an indication of what needs to be improved in the future consultations that we have remaining. And then the post-consultation survey asks the question: how well did we respond to your anticipated expectations of this particular consultation? Did we meet, exceed, or fall below your expectations? And give us particular instances and examples on what we've done well and what we need to improve on, because that will help further consultations and further participants offer a platform for engaging with them a bit more, a bit better. And we're keen to learn from you, from your experiences, and from our experiences in engaging with you, how these consultations can be improved. But for now, let's turn back to the Zoom poll. If we've got the results of those Zoom polls, I'd like to relay them back to the stakeholders. Here we are, 14% gave us a neutral evaluation, but 85% or 86% said that you were somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied, which is encouraging, but we still acknowledge that there is room for improvement. The specific opportunities for us to improve can be shared back and relayed back in the mentee.com poll, as well as the post-event questionnaire. So we look forward to seeing those results on the 2 links that we've got in the chat box. So thank you all for your contributions and participation. I'd now like to bring you back to Director Bruce Dunn, the overall director of this process, to provide us with a summary of what we can expect next, as well as to summarize what we've heard today in these consultations. So Bruce Dunn, over to you, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Azim. And thank you so much to everyone that has participated in this session today. I found it very interesting and stimulating, and I really appreciated all of the important points and comments that were raised in this session. Gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment is clearly a wider societal issue, globally. It has very dramatic effects on people's lives and sometimes lifelong effects. So it's clearly one that we obviously need to look at, and in a very culturally sensitive and appropriate way. Now, as you've heard during this session, ADB in our support for development has to be mindful of these issues and risks in our operations. We do want to be able to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals and to the equitable development for all people in the region. And we need to be very mindful, of course, that our projects don't have negative effects on people in the community or workers that could be involved in the project. And of course, we need to have special focus on vulnerable people. Now, while societal risks exist, we need to make sure that the projects are aware of those risks and don't further adversely affect or exacerbate those risks. So yeah, I think that's very much the perspective that we're coming from. We need to have a very proactive approach on these issues, but we also need to look substantively at the risk elements depending on the project and its nature and where it's located. Clearly, I think as we've heard today, also the government legal frameworks are important to be in place. Their enforcement is important, and the cultural practices. But this varies across the region, and even where the legal frameworks are in place, enforcement or cultural practices and biases can be in place. So that's something that we have to be aware of. And we've heard very much in this consultation as well that there are barriers. These topics that we've been discussing today can be taboo subjects. It can be difficult for survivors to come forward or to raise their concerns without fear of facing further abuse or harassment. And this leads to underreporting. And there can be a range of other factors as to why people don't come forward. So again, the need for us to look very sensitively at how we work through these issues. Now, coming to some of the details, you've heard ADB's safeguard policy statement currently doesn't have explicit coverage of these issues. We have reference for looking at gender and gender differentiated impacts. So of course it comes under that broader coverage, but not specifically, and there is not specific guidance in the safeguards. So ADB, in looking at this, you've heard we've developed through the Gender Equality Thematic Group, this good practice guidance note. We're seeking to pilot that, and we'll be seeking to learn experiences from that process that we can then take forward into the safeguards. Now, as we develop the safeguards further, it's important, we believe, that we take an integrated approach. Those of you that know our safeguards well will understand that we have currently safeguards that focus on environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. And they're a bit fragmented in the way that they're implemented. What we've been learning through this consultation process is that we need to take a much more integrated approach. We need to look at the relationships between environmental and social impacts and risks. And the issues that we're talking about today with sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment are certainly one where we need to take that more integrated approach. Obviously, there are social dimensions, but also projects can create risks. For example, labor influx into a project area where you can have a large number of workers that could put community members at risk from increased or elevated sexual exploitation or harassment risks. There could also be security situations with security forces and a whole range of other issues that we need to bring into the process. Plus, we didn't touch so much on it today, but I wanted to also raise intersectionality issues as being important here. Obviously, poverty, gender dimensions, including people's gender orientation and sexual identity, or disability, ethnicity. These can also contribute to additional risk factors. So these are things that we need to consider in an integrated policy moving forward. Also, the linkages with stakeholder engagement and meaningful consultation processes. We've spoken about that today, and also recognizing how that can be challenging. We spoke also a lot about the need for a survivor-focused approach and how that should link to grievance redress mechanisms. Those need to be developed and tailored for workers, for the community. We need to think about how they're established and hosted, and you heard from my colleague Malika with some recommendations there. There is the potential for a standalone grievance redress mechanism, or they could also make use of existing systems. But we need to understand that in the project context, map the availability of services, where they exist, where there are gaps, where they need to be supported. So, clearly a lot to be done on the implementation issues, and a lot of skills development, training and capacity that needs to be put in place, including, obviously working down at the country level and with our developing member countries and clients, or those that would be involved in grievance redress mechanisms or response mechanisms, but also with our own staff. And that's something that we're seeking to develop further, as you've heard Samantha Hong mentioned that earlier. So there's a lot to do, and I've just made a very brief summary now of some of the key points, but it was a rich discussion and I've not covered everything. So we will be looking carefully at the key points that were raised today and what that means for us in terms of, excuse me, the further policy development, as well as also what we take forward for the implementation of the good practice note. So again, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today. It's been really valuable. Now, just very briefly moving ahead, we have some more consultations this week on this topic. We're then going to be moving to a few additional topics for the safeguard policy update, including in the coming weeks on how we apply safeguards for different financing modalities and our work for the private sector. We'll then be moving forward with some further country consultations in about 10 countries in the region initially. And in parallel to this, we're starting the drafting process. And as I mentioned earlier, we're looking forward to having a draft policy available by about September or October this year. And we do hope that many of you will be able to take the time to have a look at that, provide further feedback, and perhaps join us for future consultations. So with that, thank you once again for joining today for this very important topic. And we look forward to having the opportunity to discuss with you in future sessions. Until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bru, and thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.